Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all safe, you're all well. Before we get started, and as I told you last week, our main subject today will be Western Sahara. Let me give you a couple of noteworthy updates and developments that occurred in the past couple of weeks. First, the situation in Myanmar, where mass demonstrations have expanded since the military coup of February 1st. And as a matter of fact, today is supposed to be a general strike in the country. These demonstrations took place mostly in the major cities of Myanmar, gathered mostly young people who do not remember the violent crackdown used by the army to put down the previous civilian protest back in 1988 and in early 2000s. And now for the first time, apparently, the junta used violence against the demonstrators yesterday. Apparently, a couple of people have been killed, and there were scores of injured people for the first time. Up to now, the military just arrested activists and opposition politicians, but for the first time, they opened fire with real bullets on the demonstrators. But for the time being, that does not seem to have discouraged them. So we see where this goes. Now, in addition, last Tuesday, you might have seen that the military also opened a closed-door trial of the two leading politicians, civilian politicians of the country, San Suu Kyi, who is accused for not only violating the law of import restrictions, but also contravening, and this is a charge that was not reported up to now, contravening a natural disaster emergency management law by interacting with a crowd during the coronavirus pandemic. And also of President Win Mint. And at this point, it's anybody's guess how long this trial will last and what the outcome will be. So this development will be monitoring it closely in the days to come. As I told you a couple of weeks ago, I do not believe personally that the junta will be dissuaded in any shape or fashion by interior unrest, as they are used to it and they have dealt with it previously. What we have to look at is the external pressure from the international community. And even though the external pressure hasn't been very efficient in previous instances, the US has declared some sanctions on the military, some of the Burmese generals, and they were joined last week by Canada and the UK. But how efficient these sanctions are remains to be seen. Obviously, for Myanmar, the most important actor is China, which is next door, and whose diplomatic support, anyway, Myanmar would really need. And up to now, China showed that, held by Russia actually, showed that at the Security Council of the United Nations, that they would not vote a resolution condemning the February 1st coup. So I believe that these sanctions are not particularly efficient for now. We'll see. And the second development actually is the first phone conversation that Joe Biden had with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu last week. About 4 weeks after Biden took office. This conversation was mostly noteworthy for 2 reasons. First, it alleviated the concerns repeatedly expressed by the Israeli authorities about the significance of such a delay in talking to each other, pointing out that this conversation occurred only after Joe Biden spoke with not only friends, leaders of other countries which are friendly to the United States, but also to the leader of China, President Xi, who is not particularly friendly. And second, the conversation took place after Biden consulted with leaders of Germany, France, and the UK on the question of Iran. Now, as you know, one of the first decisions made by this administration was to reaffirm its commitment to reopen negotiations with the Iranians on the nuclear deal, which had been signed back in 2015. However, it remains to be seen what the reactions of the Iranians will be. Last week, the Iranians met with the president of the International Atomic Energy Agency of the United Nations and told him in no uncertain terms that starting this week, Iran will no longer be bound by any additional protocol of the nuclear deal, which allowed up to now UN inspectors to conduct snap inspections on the nuclear facilities. And also that they will no longer hand over to the inspectors the recording of the tapes which monitor the activities of the Iranians in their nuclear facilities, despite the fact that that provision is a key requirement in the Iranian deal. So it remains to be seen how this is going to play out. Even though the United States wants to join again the Iranian deal, the condition for the US to join, at least up to now, the conditions the condition for the US to join these discussions would be for Iran to comply entirely with the provisions, the terms of the deal. And the Iranians are saying, we can negotiate with you, Americans and Westerners, only if the sanctions which were placed against us will be lifted. So it remains to be seen who's going to blink first. For the time being, the Iranian decision was to meet the Europeans and the United States halfway. In other words, they are saying some inspections will be allowed, not all of them, and not snap inspections, which are, by the way, the most important ones, because if you have to let them know 3 weeks ahead of time that you're going to come and inspect a facility, the element of surprise is gone, so they can readjust whatever they are doing, the Iranians. But the Iranians are saying, okay, we let you inspectors come in and look around for the next 3 months, and that will open the door for some kind of negotiations. 3 months from now, if this issue has not been resolved and the sanctions are still in place against us, we're going to not comply at all with the deal. So that's another thing that remains to be seen. To what extent the new administration is willing to accommodate the Iranian government. One extra thing is that the Iranian, in a way, they cornered themselves because they have elections, presidential elections in 3 months, 4 months. And the conservative camp is pushing very hard for the Iranian government to stop complying at all with the deal. So the Iranian government has to take that, and the President Rouhani, who's supposedly moderate, has to take that into account for the next 4 months at least. And then based on the outcome of the elections, then it remains to be seen how new negotiation, if any, will be conducted. All right, so these are the two things that I had wanted to bring to your attention. And now we are going to take a look at Western Sahara. Why Western Sahara, you must be wondering. Since most Americans have probably never heard of that desertic place. And if the name of this territory, the size of more or less Colorado, in Northwest Africa, evokes any image at all, it is likely those of vast and empty-looking land with parching 120-degree days, fierce sandstorms, and nomads with their tents and camels. Paradoxically, the reason why we are even looking at Western Sahara today and take the time to address this issue has very little to do actually with Western Sahara itself, and more with the decision made by the outgoing administration in the last days of the Trump presidency to change the reality on the ground in Western Sahara after 50 years of status quo, to change it by recognizing Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara. But before addressing the political situation in the territory, let's get a little more familiar with that region. Michel, if you don't mind putting up the first map, please. Now, Western Sahara lies along the Atlantic coast of Northwest Africa, opposite to the Canary Islands, which are Spanish, and is bounded by, here we go, thank you, Michel. And it's bounded, as you can tell, if you look at the map, by Morocco to the north, Algeria to the west, and Mauritania to the south and east. Spain seized Western Sahara back in 1883. By the way, Western Sahara is called today as Africa's last major colony. Spain seized it in 1883 after an international conference of European powers, colonial powers, convened in Berlin, in Germany, to divide their spheres of influence in Africa. But it took Spain some 50 years to achieve complete control of the region, of the interior of Western Sahara. In 1934, 1935. Yet Spanish colonization never prevented Morocco to the north to claim sovereignty over the region. First, let's see who are the Sahrawi, or the Sahrawi in Arabic, Sahrawi people living in that territory. The name Sahrawi comes from the Arabic word Sahara, which means desert. They largely speak Hassania, which is a dialect of Arabic. And many of them have mixed Berber and Arab heritage. The Sahrawi are traditionally nomadic Bedouins. There are no reliable censuses held there, but an estimated 600,000 people live in Western Sahara. Morocco controls parts of most of Western Sahara, and only 30,000 people, more or less, live in the interior, which is controlled by a pro-independent movement. Conflict and political considerations have led to major population displacement in that area. Encouraged by the Moroccan government, many people from parts of Morocco have settled in Western Sahara, and these latest arrivals today are sought to outnumber the indigenous Western Sahara Sahrawi. At the same time, because of the ongoing conflict there, a number of Sahrawis left the region to settle in Morocco and parts of Mauritania. Some others moved to refugee camps in Algeria, particularly around the city of Tindouf that you can see on the map in Algeria, not far from the Western Saharan border. And some Sahrawis even left for Spain. Until more than a decade ago, the majority of the indigenous population led, as I said earlier, a nomadic existence, arising from the desert unsuitability for farming and the need to move toward areas where there is sufficient rainfall and in areas that supports an animal-based economy. That situation changed somewhat with the discovery of the world's fourth largest phosphate deposit at Bukra in 1963. You can see Bukra here in the middle, rather in the northern part of the Western Sahara, halfway between the Atlantic Ocean and Mauritania, Bukra, right here. Subsequently, some of these people, the indigenous Sahrawis, settled in small cities and towns by the 1970s, particularly in the area of La Ayun, which you can see here on the map also, on the Atlantic Ocean, which is the largest city in Western Sahara. From a political standpoint, the new urban elite, so to speak, inspired by the worldwide anti-colonial movement at the time, began to form nationalist political movements. After 1966, the UN General Assembly passed several resolutions calling for a UN-supervised referendum in the Western Sahara to enable the indigenous population, and I quote, to exercise freely its right to self-determination and independence. At the same time, however, Morocco and Mauritania asserted historical claims to the area, arguing that the results of any true consultation with the people of the territory would be favorable to their respective causes and countries. In 1975, after the death of the Spanish leader, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, Spain withdrew from Western Sahara, and the following year, in 1976, Western Sahara was partitioned between Morocco and Mauritania, with Morocco acquiring the northern 2/3 of the region. When Mauritania, under pressure from the Sahrawi independent movement, abandoned all claims to its portion, Morocco moved in to occupy it as well, and has since asserted administrative control over the whole territory of Western Sahara, calling Western Sahara the southern provinces of Morocco, officially actually, consisting of the Rio de Oro and Sagia regions, which are right here. The portion not under the control of the Moroccan government that lies between the Moroccan Western Sahara wall or berm. You can see it. You see this yellow line. This is the wall, which is basically a structure of approximately 1,700 miles long, mostly a sand wall, running through Western Sahara and the southwestern portion of Morocco. Here you are. This region came under the control of the major pro-independent movement called the Polisario Front. The Polisario Front saw Spain's decision to grant Morocco much of Western Sahara as an affront to the sacrosanct principle of self-determination. And in 1975, established the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, claiming control over the entire region of Western Sahara at the same time when Morocco was occupying the whole region. Ever since, the Moroccan authorities refer to the Polisario Front as terrorists, whose intention is to enslave the Sahrawi people. So as you can tell, at the same time, Morocco and the Polisario Front claimed ownership of Western Sahara after Spain withdrew. Now, the two sides clashed on and off for 16 years until 1991, when a UN-brokered ceasefire was signed. That ceasefire confirmed the Moroccan control of the western side of the 1,700 miles wall, the western side, which goes from the wall to the Atlantic Ocean, and including the significant mineral resources and offshore oil in that area. And also the UN, in order to monitor the ceasefire between the two opposing sides, deployed a UN mission called the MINURSO, which is a French acronym for the United Nations Mission for a Referendum in Western Sahara, which is currently made up, that was established back in 1975, and it's still in place. But it's a smaller mission, including 220 military personnel, I think, and supported by some 250 civilian staff. The ceasefire also set up the promise of a UN-supervised referendum, but the popular consultation has been postponed indefinitely by Morocco. Now, this situation prevailed in the territory for 3 decades, around 30 years, 29 years, up to a couple of months ago when Morocco launched a military incursion into the UN-controlled buffer zone in order to reopen the only road leading from Morocco to Mauritania, right here, and the rest of West Africa, a road that the Polisario Front had blocked the previous month. The Polisario Front responded by declaring the ceasefire null and void, arguing that the road had not existed when the ceasefire was signed and therefore was illegal. The two sides exchanged fire along the demarcation, along this wall. But even though the flare-up was short-lived, the episode highlights just how susceptible the region is to armed confrontation between the two sides. Now, there are a number of factors that push the Moroccan government to cling to Western Sahara. First, a powerful nationalism, which has been used by King Hassan first, and then by his son, Mohammed VI, to bolster their internal political standing. Second, a larger control over Saharan phosphates by Morocco, obviously, which already provides, as I say, 40% of the world's phosphates exports, and you would like to see these exports significantly increase by an additional 20 to 25%, which are around here in Bukra. And finally, the Moroccan concern in the past few years over the emergence of a shift in the regional balance favoring Polisario's claims. Indeed, dozens of countries, including most of them in Africa, as well as the African Union itself, have formally recognized the Sahrawi Republic, though no world's major power have done so. And many more have expressed varying degree of support. The strongest one being by Algeria, which is, you can see it next to Morocco and also next to the Western Sahara, which borders both of them actually, and which has been actively supporting the Polisario front. As I said earlier, there are about 100,000 Sahrawi refugees around Tindouf here, living in refugee camps. And some of them, apparently, according to Moroccan sources, are being trained by the Algerians. The Algerian support to the Polisario, goes back to the 1970s as a strategic political counter to Moroccan expansionism, and perhaps also a quest to a more secure passageway to the Atlantic for Algeria's own iron exports. That support has turned since into an ideological commitment to the same sort of armed struggle for self-determination that Algeria itself engaged in the 1950s and 1960s against France. Algeria hotly denies the Moroccan claim according to which Polisario is a wholly owned and operated subsidiary of the Algerian government, created for the sole purpose of advancing Algeria's geopolitical interests in the region and making trouble for Morocco, and argues that the liberation movement is genuinely independent and indigenous, and that while Algeria has a real sense of ideological identification with the Polisario movement, it does not exercise any direct control over it. Since the positions of the Polisario and of Morocco seem irreconcilable, you must be wondering why the United Nations-backed referendum on self-determination has never taken place. The major bone of contention is over who could participate in the popular consultation. As I said earlier, over the years, Morocco encouraged a large number of its citizens to settle in Western Sahara through numerous economic and financial incentives. sharply shifting the demographic balance, and presumably local public opinion. For its part, the Polisario Front argues that those settlers should not be allowed to cast their vote, since they do not represent the population of Sahrawi descent, pointing out that most of the world considers Morocco's resettlement policy illegal. So this is where the Western Sahara imbroglio stood up to now, especially since the suspension of the UN-backed political process in March 2019. When on December 10th of last year, of 2020, the White House announced that Morocco had agreed to normalize its relations with Israel, becoming the fourth Arab state to do so, and that the United States would recognize Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara. This is an issue that's been out there for a long time, and quite frankly, there has just been no progress on on a resolution. Jared Kushner, Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law, said back in December, adding that the US recognition can possibly break the logjam to help advance the issue. By the way, speaking of just for a second about the Moroccan-Israeli normalization, the deal has been highly popular in Israel, which has, as you might know, a sizable population of Jews of Moroccan descent who arrived massively in Israel in the 50s and early 60s. It should be noted, though, that the two countries have cooperated for years and before any type of normalization, official anyway, formal, on military and intelligence matters. And they went as far as establishing liaison offices in 1994 in the wake of the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, the so-called Oslo Accords. Those liaison offices, however, closed down after the outbreak of the second Palestinian uprising or intifada back in 2000. This temporary political cooling between Israel and Morocco did not prevent, however, many Israelis from visiting Morocco and whatever families they had left behind, traveling via third countries to Morocco, but entering Morocco on Israeli passports. Morocco obviously could also reap gains from normalizing relations with Israel, benefiting from Israel's expertise in areas of intelligence and high-tech weaponry, following the example of Azerbaijan, for instance, whose success in its recent war with Armenia rested heavily on the use of sophisticated drones supplied by Israel. But for Morocco, the normalization, the biggest prize for its normalization of diplomatic relations with Israel is undoubtedly the American recognition of its sovereignty over Western Sahara. King Mohammed, like his father, Hassan I, have called for decades for international recognition of the territory as part of Morocco. To receive it first from the United States is a boost, number one, in prestige, and may raise Moroccan hopes that other countries will follow suit. Now, for the United States, granting recognition was not an easy decision. While it is taking the side of Morocco, obviously, which is an old friend and ally, it goes against the principle of self-determination that an overwhelming majority of countries in the world support, very much like the United States itself has defended in the past. And second, and even most important, that decision posed once again the fundamental question raised by the American previous experiences in countries like Angola, Iran, and Nicaragua, which is whether US policy must always accommodate its friends, even when these friends cling to ill-conceived or untenable positions, or whether the American interests are better served by adapting to compelling regional circumstances. Supporters of Trump's recognition of Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara maintain that it will lead to greater stability in the region, with Morocco better able and equipped to tackle transnational threats harming the North Africa region and Europe, mainly terrorism. Its critics fear, however, that the deal might lead to more conflict in this volatile part of the world, already ravaged by a decade of war in Libya, conflict in Mali and Central Africa, which are neighboring countries, and create perhaps openings for violent Islamic groups operating in several countries in the region. They also point out that the recognition undermines the UN-led process for an indigenous Sahrawi people to decide on their fate, independence, or larger autonomy within a wider federation. That being said, the reality of the ground is that the UN-sponsored talks have stalled over Moroccan's consistent refusal to entertain the prospect of independence for the Sahrawi, saying only autonomy was on the table. And also, it is not at all clear whether the Polisario Front or Morocco are willing or able to resume fighting on a larger scale, or how willing other countries are to get involved. But now, with Trump gone, what are Joe Biden's options? While the sweeping manner in which Biden has attempted already to reverse some of Trump's decisions clearly intends to send a message of change and progress, Biden himself is hardly a radical politician prone to ideas out of the mainstream. Also, Biden's preferred manner of diplomacy appears to closely align with that of President Obama's administration, which appeared in its time wary to involve itself in the Western Saharan issue. That being said, Biden could attempt to reverse Trump's decision regarding Western Sahara, arguing that it came in the waning days of the Trump's presidency, and this decision appends years of US diplomacy. But if Biden were to choose that option, he could also face opposition from several influential sources of power in the United States, such as the Pentagon, for which Trump's decision presented an opportunity to expand US military influence in the Sahel, and perhaps even established a military base in Morocco, as rumors of secret negotiations on the subject are currently being discussed, apparently, and reported by the Spanish media. Now, why Spain? Spain is a concerned party. Michelle, if you don't mind putting up the second map, please. Spain feels concerned and worries about such a possibility of having the US open a military base in Western Sahara. Thank you. Because Spain hosts already a large military base, American base, in Rota. You see the red arrow here, close to Tangiers, close to the Moroccan coast also. And that military base serves as a refueling and rearming hub for missions in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Should this base be transferred to Morocco, it would mean a huge loss of income and jobs for Spain. On the diplomatic front, a reversal of Trump's decisions could also endanger Israel's diplomatic normalization with Morocco, since reversing Trump's decision would mean that the US would not longer recognize Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, in which case Morocco would have no incentive, actually, to normalize its diplomatic relations with Israel, probably. And not to mention that it would offend Morocco, a key strategic, as I said earlier, a key strategic ally in this area. Changing Western Sahara's status would also mean overturning diplomatic precedents and making other countries reluctant to make deals with the United States, with diminished trust in continuity through administration. If they believe that if one administration comes in and reverses the decision of the previous one, what's the point in signing a deal with the United States in the first place? And the last factor to consider is the practical side of such a decision. The new administration, which is currently facing an economic crisis, the COVID pandemic, and the country which is deeply divided along partisan lines, can ill afford spending precious time on the issue of Western Sahara, that most Americans ignore, or very few Americans are concerned with. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen there, but definitely I do not believe that it will be one of the priorities in foreign policy of the Biden administration. But I still wanted you to get a little more familiar with that area that probably never comes up unless there is conflict and fighting over there. So today you'll have to unmute yourself and in asking questions, because unfortunately, as I told you, I have a problem here. I don't have my chat box where you can put in your questions. So the floor is open, not only on the Western Sahara, but on anything that you'd be interested in.
Don Evanson. Would you talk to the importance maybe of the Western Sahara and the Great Western Sahara for migrants working their way north from Central Africa into Europe?
Actually, very few migrants come through Western Sahara to Europe, for the simple reason that the Moroccans are trying to stop any kind of migration movement, even if it's only a transit. They have agreement with the Spanish government and with the other European Union countries to that effect, to try and stop the migrants to come into Western Sahara. Number one. And number two, as I told you, it's a very difficult region to travel in. You have, besides the Polisario Front, a number of groups which are not politically connected, but which are just terrorist groups or so. It's very risky to go through Western Sahara, not to mention that the conditions are very difficult. So no, you don't have too many people coming through there. And number three, most of them come through Libya because they can reach the Italian coast more easily, or Malta, or they go through Greece. Going through Spain, making it to Tangiers and going to Spain, it's very difficult, again, because the Spaniards and the Moroccans work together in trying to prevent such a movement. So no, there are no migrants to speak of through Western Sahara. You have to unmute yourself. I can hear you. I think there are people speaking in the background, but you have to unmute yourself. Yes?
You have it open.
Hello?
You hit mute. No, it's not. You're open.
It's open. I can hear you. Do you have a question? You're not inspired by Western Sahara, I see. Okay, but if you're not inspired, there is nothing in the past 2 weeks that might have drawn your attention internationally.
Pierre, it's Don again. I visited Morocco several years ago, and some of my discussions with local businessmen and whatnot, they seem to have regretted that the Jews had left Morocco, that they represented an integral part of Moroccan culture and business. And so I think that this agreement with Israel is probably very welcome to the Moroccans.
Well, as I told you, the connections between the Jews who left Morocco and went to Israel, or to France for that matter. A number of Moroccan Jews left Morocco for France. That connections have survived all the political tensions between Morocco and Israel per se. Israeli citizens, for instance, had never had any issue traveling to Morocco. So for the two governments, it might make sense. For the Moroccan government, the only difference is that they can now be open about it, actually, even though I should say that for the time being, there was no date set for the opening of embassies in Rabat and Tel Aviv. Probably they won't recognize Jerusalem yet as the capital of Israel, most likely. So that has never stopped. There are still, I would say, about 10,000 Jews in Morocco, which is a very small number compared to what it was. Most of them having left after the 1956 war with Israel. And the few who were left, it was after the 1960s, the so-called Six-Day War between the Arab countries and Israel. That being said, Morocco has never sent even token troops to fight the Israelis, not in the 50s and not in the 60s. Unlike other Arab countries, which are not neighbors of Israel, but who, for instance, Iraq, which sent troops through Syria to fight the Israeli army. Morocco has never done it. As a matter of fact, no northern African country has sent troops to fight Israel in any of the previous wars. So the relations, even though formally were non-existent, consultations and discussions behind the scene were frequent and took place frequently between Morocco and Israel. So yes, that deal, if you will, it's relatively popular in Morocco, where also you have a number of people who are pro-Palestinian and who do not particularly enjoy that deal, it must be said. But by and large, there were no street demonstrations against it, if you will, when it was announced.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I read something in the paper this morning, and it wasn't very clear, about the Arab population in Israel mounting I guess an opposition party to Netanyahu to run for the next prime minister. Do you know anything about that?
Well, that's not new. As you know, during the last elections, the Arab political parties there are several. The Arab political parties, for the first time, united, and they gained a number of seats in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. I think they had in the previous parliament, in the latest parliament, they had 11 seats out of 120. So it represents something. And they already ran against Netanyahu in the last elections. So this is not particularly new.
I wonder why they would the Times would be covering it now. Is it just because elections are coming up?
Because the elections are next month, a month from today, actually. So they are covering. You'll have more reports on Israel and the political situation there than you would have normally. But my speaking of Israel, I think that these are the fourth elections that the Israelis have to go through in 2 years, which is, I mean, every 6 months they had an election. And I think the public opinion, you have the background of the pandemic, and now you have the elections next month. I believe by and large, the public is sick and tired of elections. And this time, I think Netanyahu will win a majority decisively, not because he's more popular than he was 6 months ago, but because most people who voted for Benny Gantz, who's a main opponent of Netanyahu, were very disappointed when Gantz joined Netanyahu's government, actually, after saying all this time that he would never work with someone, with a prime minister who was indicted for bribery, and he would never join such a government. The first thing he did, the day after the elections, they formed a coalition government, and he became vice prime minister for 18 months. That was the deal. Netanyahu was supposed to be in charge for 18 months, and then Benny Gantz was supposed to take over. So in my opinion, as an observer, I believe that his political career is done. He lost all credibility. So his white and blue party, which re-emerged with different people, will not get too many. I mean, he's the leader of nothing right now. He represents only himself. He shot himself in the foot in a way. And Netanyahu, by calling elections, snap elections now, definitely is getting rid of his main threat politically, was Benny Gantz. On the left, there is nobody really who might be a credible rival to Netanyahu. So I believe that this time the Likud, Netanyahu's party, will get not a large majority, because, as you know, there are so many parties in Israel, and the electoral system is such there is a fragmentation in the number of parties, which are, most of them are represented in the parliament, since you need only less than 3% threshold of votes to be represented in the parliament. So I believe that he will this time he will win decisively. Also because everything that the public opinion sees Netanyahu, his achievements in a way, not only internationally with the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem, and the fact that with the American peace plan, and the fact that there are 4 Arab countries which have formally recognized Israel, with more to come apparently in the very near future. Oman probably will be the next one. And now with Biden president in the United States, there are very good chances that Saudi Arabia might jump into it also, to show to Biden that to forget about the Khashoggi incident and try to show a more flexible side of Saudi Arabia. So number one. And number two, the other achievement for the Israeli population is relative success that Israel achieved in the vaccination campaign. 50% of the Israelis received the first dose of the vaccine already, which is the highest in the world. All right, the population is relatively small, a little more than 9 million people, but at least 4.5 million had received the vaccine already, and I think 1.5 or 2 million had received the second dose already. So for all those reasons, I think Netanyahu has a very, very good chance to win this time decisively, a larger majority anyway in the parliament, and prime ministership now for another 4 or 5 years. Not so much because they again, that he's so popular, but there is nobody else.
That's true.
That's the same reason which might guide the French electorate, which is in a different situation, to vote for Macron again last year in the French presidential elections, because there is nobody else. There won't be a vote for someone, there will be a vote against someone, and that against someone will be the leader of the National Front, or who will be in this, probably will be running against Macron, like she did Marine Le Pen in the second round of the elections of 2017. She will be there in 2022. So it will be a repeat of the 2017 elections. When people voted for Macron, remember Macron was totally unknown at the time. He had no party. He was 38 or 39. He came from the bank and had absolutely no experience. Well, he had been the economy minister of in the previous government for a few months before resigning. He came from the private sector out of nowhere, out of the left field, and he got elected because people voted against the National Front, not so much for him. Now his popularity is not great. They don't particularly care for him 4 years later, and probably there is still a 1 year to go. So it remains to be seen. Many things can happen within the next 12 months. That being said, there is nobody else in France, either on the left or on the right, who might challenge really Macron. So by default, if you will, there are very good chances, like Netanyahu, for many other reasons, but there are very good chances that he will be re-elected for another 5-year term. Anything else? I'm surprised nobody's talking about Russia. Usually there is always a question on Navalny or what's going on in Russia. Nothing today. I think the Western Sahara just wiped you out. Well, nothing is happening in Russia, actually. As you might have seen, Navalny stood a second trial for slandering a war veteran in Russia, for which he was fined. No prison time, but he was fined. Well, he's in prison. He's still in prison, and he will be normally for the next couple of years. But as you could see also, and as I predicted in a way, you can tell that the demonstrations have slowed down a little bit in Russia for Navalny. So it's back to business as usual for Putin. He has no things to worry about coming from Navalny, not at this time.
Pierre?
Yes.
There's a question in chat from Larry Bergman about what did...
Yeah, but as I told you, unfortunately, don't send me questions in chat because I cannot see it. So
Well,
unmute yourselves. Just a second. Unmute yourself for those who did not hear me before. For some reason, I don't have the chat box. Okay, so just ask me, unmute yourself and ask a question.
All right. Well, then Larry should ask it since...
Okay. Okay. Oh, you're Larry's lawyer?
Thank you for being my attorney.
Larry.
My question was that I heard...
Why are you Larry, why are you so shy? Speak up.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
My question was, I had read that Netanyahu, during one of his hearings, had walked out of the hearing declaring himself innocent and just left the hearing. Will there be any repercussions for that?
If he left the hearings in the middle of the hearings, probably he knows that there will be no repercussions. I don't believe that the tribunal has enough evidence he was indicted actually, but I do not believe that they have enough evidence to really put him away for a while. So if he's brazen enough to get up and just leave the audience, the room, he must know that he's on solid ground. And then nothing will happen to him. This trial might go on for a while, and everybody, obviously, people who do not care so much for Netanyahu, suggested that the elections do not take place before the end of this trial. But it seems that the elections will go ahead on the 22nd of March, as scheduled. And by that time, I don't believe the trial will be over. So if his party wins again, and as a leader of the party, as you know, the system in Israel, they don't elect someone, they vote for a party. And the party which has the largest number of voters, its leader becomes prime minister. So if his party wins the elections, as I suspect it will, then he will be off the hook because he'll get immunity for any type of indictment. No, but trial till he finishes his term. which might take another 4 or 5 years. So it's for all intents and purposes, this trial will not really get him in trouble, and he must know that. Anything else? Is it lunchtime?
Yes.
Yeah, that's why. Well, you cannot go out because it's snowing, so you might as well stay with me and ask me if you. All right. So again, I don't believe that Western Sahara will had inspired you too much, or having a break last week. But then we'll meet again next Monday, and I'm still hesitant on the subject that we'll address next Monday. It will be either, it depends, it will be either the first decisions of the Biden administration in terms of foreign policy, or I think we might leave it to the following week, which will be March the 8th, will be our last session of this, last class of this session, of the winter session. And then next week, which is Monday, the 1st of March, we're already in March, God, it goes fast. On March 1st, we might look at the Israeli-Palestinian, Palestinian, not Arab, Israeli-Palestinian issue now with Biden president, and also with the decision by the PLO in the Western Bank to organize elections coming up also in the next couple of months, which might change somewhat the situation there in the area. I don't know yet. We'll see. All right, but hopefully either subject will be more inspirational to you than Western Sahara was today. But I still wanted you to look at. I was right with Myanmar, because things are happening in Myanmar and we never went there, so to speak, previously. So Myanmar was a subject that I wanted to address and to take up with you. And I also wanted to just to get you a little more familiarized with Western Sahara. And I can tell that you didn't know much about Western Sahara by the lack of questions on Western Sahara, but that's fine. That's fine. So I guess unless there is something else at the last moment, there is something else. If not, keep safe, be well. And then I see you all next Monday, same place, same time, hopefully with less snow starting in March. Have a nice week. Michelle, thank you very much.